all of you guys coming out. Really quick, I'd like to acknowledge and give a shout out to Chevy and Michaela over here. They're here from Lead Sustainability Coordinators, and they're making this a zero waste event, so thank you guys. Also, huge shout outs to Dr. Hausdorfer, Dr. Clark. Thank you so much for all of your help and guidance. And Selen, of course, as always. Thank you so much.
All right, so like I said, this is our presentation for our capstone class. We are talking about divestment and how this could be an option on Western's campus. Basically, divestment is the opposite of investment. It's removing stocks or bonds from certain, we want to remove it from fossil fuels. It can be used in other capacities that we'll touch on later in our presentation. I'm Kendall Cox.
Taylor Paulson.
Sam Leslie-Nikuski.
Jocelyn LaRue.
Carrie Ann Conroy.
Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, well,
Shoot.
do you want me to repeat everything I just said? Go ahead.
So we all came together, invested in how we can help Western address climate change.
And we chose divestment because it seemed like a tangible option that we as students could undertake as a means of more aggressively and directly addressing climate change.
And when proposing our project, it was really important for us to honor the science that got us here. So we referred to Newton's third law of motion, which states that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And this seems particularly relevant in the context of a warming atmosphere caused by human activity. So it begs the question and consideration, how can we positively change our actions to better address a changing climate? Because it's enough that rapid glacial melt and rising sea levels are having a high-risk impact to our most vulnerable global communities. But when we bring this issue home, we see that there are observable consequences of climate change here in the Southwest Rockies.
Some of these impacts that we've seen in the Rockies are widespread bark beetle outbreaks. If you've ever been south of here into Hinsdale County, there's over 90% spruce death from bark beetles, and there's a lot of factors that have contributed to this, but one of which is climate change. We've also seen differing precipitation levels, so we've seen some drought years and low snow years, and we've also, like this past winter, seen a lot more snow. So this can contribute to differing water levels in the Gunnison River, and everything in this valley relies on water, such as the agriculture, ranching, as well as recreation. And recreation is a huge draw for what brings people here to Western. And the impacts that we have felt here and will continue to feel will make Gunnison less of what it is. So going forward in our presentation, we're first going to talk about the President's climate commitment, and we will then talk about what Western has already done in order to achieve the goals outlined by the President's climate commitment. We will then talk about divestment and historically what it's looked like in terms of other divestment movements. We'll then look specifically at fossil fuel divestment and what it could mean for us at Western. At the end, we'll break into 4 different tables where we can have discussions, and we'll outline those a little bit more later. And then we'll come back together and hopefully open it up to some question and answer and some group discussion. All right, so just a quick show of hands, who has heard of the President's climate commitment? Great, most of you. So for those of you who don't know, the President's climate commitment basically commits us to becoming carbon neutral by 2050. It was signed in 2007 by then President Jay Hellman. He signed on to the American College University President's Climate Commitment. This is basically a coalition of like-minded colleges and universities who believe that higher education has a responsibility to lead on these types of issues.
So what motivated Western to sign on to it? We believe that we had a responsibility to graduate local, regional, national, and global leaders. And because Western is already such a leader in this community, we believe that we had a responsibility to take initiative for what impacts our local actions have on our broader global communities. So that prompted the signing in 2007, and in 2009 we saw the climate action plan detailed. So what we did, we took a greenhouse gas emissions survey based on 1998 through 2007, and we based some of these goals on the 2006 levels. So the first goal we had was to reduce our emissions from 2006 levels by 20% by 2020, and we have already met that, so go ahead and give yourselves a pat on the back, because that's all you guys. The next step in this plan was to reach 50% emission reductions by 2035, and right now we are extremely close to meeting that, so it's another pat on the back if you want. But our next goal is to reach absolute carbon neutrality by 2050. Like we mentioned, we've done a lot of things to try to reach these goals already. We have met some of them, but there's always more we can do. But we will talk about very briefly the actions that we have taken to try to meet these goals.
So as Kendall was saying, there are already a lot of steps Western has taken in the direction of carbon neutrality, both pre and post the 2007 signing of the Presidential Climate Commitment. One such example of a pre-signing step in accordance with carbon neutrality is the Chipeta Garden. It's a student-led initiative down at Chipeta in which students can engage and actively learn with local and organic food systems. And this helps foster a mentality of environmental stewardship and keep moving towards goals of carbon neutrality. And this happened before the signing of the Presidential Climate Commitment. And since the signing of the Presidential Climate Commitment, other steps have been taken towards reaching that goal. A key example of this would be the bike library located at the library. It's a service available to students which they can rent townie bicycles, pictured there in the top left corner, I guess your right corner, free of charge for up to 3 days, and provides safe, fun, and emissionless travel for students in and around Gunnison. And this is, again, in accordance with carbon reduction and the ultimate goal of carbon neutrality.
And something else that Western has done since the signing of the President's Climate Commitment is develop the Renewable Energy Fund. This was developed in 2012 as an optional fee for students. It's $15 per semester, totaling $30 over the year. And this creates a large pool of money that can be used in order to help Western continue towards that goal of carbon neutrality. And a pretty exciting step in that recently, President Salisbury has agreed to start doing renewable energy credits again in order to help offset our carbon emissions. And he has also challenged students and faculty campus-wide in order to seek ways that we can continue developing our use of renewable energy. So one of these is the proposed 2-megawatt solar farm on campus. There's other options that we have available here in the Gunnison Valley, such as ground source heat, geothermal, and even methane capture. So something that we found here at Western is this is the building's energy use and greenhouse gas emissions, and it's projected forward from 2015 to 2020. As you can see here on the right graph, left graph, I guess, it's the energy use of our buildings, and in gray is natural gas, and in red is electricity. And you can see that we use a lot more natural gas in our buildings in order to provide electricity. But our greenhouse gas emissions, electricity is almost half of our total greenhouse gas emissions. So if we were able to implement this renewable energy fee in ways that we can use solar or geothermal, any of those options I previously mentioned, then we can see this greenhouse gas emissions bar get significantly smaller.
So in reviewing the work of the students that came before us, we were really compelled by this idea brought up in the President Climate Commitment Action Plan of students assuming constructive roles in the context of climate change. Because institutions of higher learning wouldn't exist without their students, and so that puts us in a really unique position to demand change where we see fit. And so we then looked to the PCC's mitigation principles, the framework laid out by these students for us to actually reduce the severity of the threat that climate change imposes on us, and how divestment could fit into that idea of a constructive role. And we found this quote about the significance of symbolic acts in fostering cultural change, even if they are without financial benefit. And so that's where divestment truly fits in, because when you take your stocks or your bonds or your investments out of an industry, there's no guarantee that it will have an impact, because it opens up for somebody else to put their investments there. But the symbolism behind it is so critical, and that's why we see divestment as a useful tool in this larger strategy for change. And we definitely agree with the Rachel Carson quote that in conserving our planet or in addressing climate change, there's no shortage of work to do, and there's no end to that work. And divestment has continuously proven itself as a useful tool in fostering cultural change.
All right, so like Karen was saying, divestment has been used in a number of different strategies. One of those where divestment has been used as a tactic is against the fight against big tobacco. So big tobacco divestment started in the 1980s and continues in some facet today, with a recent example being the University of Pennsylvania and their divestment campaign in 2014. So when University of Pennsylvania was trying to decide whether or not they were going to divest from tobacco, they had to decide if they were going to back their faculty's moral declarations or if they were going to stick with their financial obligations. Many times they were seeing that their fiduciary obligations were to those same faculty who were trying to bring about this change. So they had to try to figure out what they were going to do with this. They had to see if they could balance the ethical and social policy with their fiscal policy. And you see, the responsibilities of a company, or in this case, a university, surpass the maximization of shareholder value. Although the fiduciary responsibility is highly important, a company or university also has to consider and balance the social, ethical, and environmental interests of its stakeholders. In the case of University of Pennsylvania, its stakeholders were its faculty. In our case, it is ourselves and anyone who stands with our divestment campaign. But it doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be both. Dr. John Gerard is a director of quantitative research at McKinley Capital, which is a private investment advisor specializing in global and international growth equity strategies. He conducted a study and found that it could be both. He found that socially responsible investing produced higher risk-adjusted portfolio returns than just not divesting at all or divesting from just one faucet, such as tobacco. So environmental, alcohol, tobacco, gaming, military, and nuclear screens produce portfolios with higher excess returns than just tobacco or just unscreened portfolios. They found that this was because an investor could expect lower returns to these sorts of companies when one considers the possible corporate expenses of fines and litigations. So this basically says you don't have to necessarily choose between maximizing your shareholder values and getting the most out of your money and backing moral declarations of students, faculty, anyone who's pushing for these campaigns. You can achieve both.
So as Kendall was saying, divestment is a tactic that has been employed oftentimes as part of a broader strategy to instigate social change. And perhaps the most famous and influential instance of this would be the anti-apartheid movement, specifically surrounding divestment. And briefly, apartheid was the system of government in which the white minority of South Africa imposed racist law under which the non-white majority had their rights systematically stripped and were oppressed. And understandably, this produced results of outrage in folks inclined towards justice and equity. And this outrage manifested itself in many different ways, particularly in the form of active resistance fronts. And these were active the world over, the US included. And particularly in the US, the most active form of resistance was calls for divestment in which oftentimes student-led organizations urged colleges, universities, and businesses to divest their interests from South Africa. And this tactical shift towards divestment came about as a recognition that the South African government directly benefited from foreign aid, particularly from the United States. And the divestment tactic really got a strong hold in the mid to late 60s, and it garnered results. In 1968, the United Methodist Board of Missions withdrew its $10 million portfolio from the First National City Bank, which was at that point a primary lender of money to South Africa. Princeton University in the same year ceased buying stocks and banks that directly loaned funds to South Africa. And by 1969, the top 10 US banks that were lending money to South Africa ceased to do so. And this momentum carried on from the 1960s into the 1970s, again with calls for divestment. Though in the iteration of the divestment movement in the 70s, it took on a more institutionalized stance, often employing ethical and social criteria for investment screening processes. And this again produced results. In 1978, 40 colleges and universities had adopted some sort of screening process for South African businesses. And by 1979, 135 US businesses had done the same. But towards the end of the 1970s, the divestment movement kind of harkened back to its original, more hard-lined and radical roots, again, regaining the call for total divestment. And in 1977, Hampshire College became the first US business, or entity rather, to divest entirely from South Africa. And in 1978, the University of Wisconsin in Ohio did the same. And this momentum carried on into the 1980s, whereby between 1986 and 1987, 75 US colleges and universities had divested either partially or fully from South Africa. And perhaps the biggest victory that the 1980s iteration of the divestment movement saw was in 1986 when Congress overrode then President Ronald Reagan's veto of the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, which placed economic and trade sanctions on South Africa under the condition that they would remain in place until apartheid was abolished. And this is significant because up to this point, Reagan had attributed anti-apartheid actions in South Africa to pro-communist influences, and is quoted as saying that the US concerns should be the social, economic, and physical well-being of the white people in this land they love and have sacrificed so much to build. And what this really does is this points to the impact that the divestment movement had as a whole. At a time when the leader of the nation was expressing sentiments like these, the people of the nation were expressing sentiments to the contrary, and as a result, pressured their government to act in accordance with their beliefs. Divestment effectively helped to reshape the national conversation surrounding apartheid, and as a result, forced people to realign and reconsider their collective moral stance on the issue. And though this movement in the United States played a role in toppling the apartheid regime, it would be ludicrous and dishonest to think that the regime was totally toppled by predominantly white, privileged college students in the US. There were many active fronts the world over, particularly in South Africa, and a key player in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa was Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who to this day is still active in climate and social justice movements, as we will see in this video here.
The destruction of the Earth's environment is the human rights challenge of our time. Over the 25 years that climate change has been on the world's agenda, global emissions have risen unchecked, while real-world impacts have taken hold in earnest. Time is running out. We are already experiencing loss of life and livelihood because of intensified storms, shortage of fresh water, spread of disease, rising food prices, and the creation of climate refugees. The most devastating effects are visited on the poor, those with no involvement in creating the problem, a deep injustice. Just as we argued in the 1980s that those who conducted business with apartheid in South Africa were aiding and abetting an immoral system, today we say nobody should profit from the rising temperatures, seas, and human suffering caused by the burning of fossil fuels. We can no longer continue feeding our addiction to fossil fuels as if there is no tomorrow, for there will be no tomorrow. We're on the cusp of a global transition to a new, safe energy economy. We must support our leaders to make the correct moral choices. Freeze further exploration for new fossil sources. We cannot maintain a livable temperature and climate for humanity if we burn more than a fraction of the fossil fuels already discovered. Hold those responsible for climate damages accountable. Change the profit incentive by demanding legal liability for unsustainable environmental practices. Encourage governments to stop accepting funding from the fossil fuel industry that blocks action on climate change. Divest from fossil fuels and invest in a clean energy future. Move your money out of the problem and into solutions. There is a word we use in South Africa that describes human relationships. Ubuntu. It says, I am because you are. My success and my failures are bound up in yours. We are made for each other, part of one family, the human family, with one shared earth. God bless you.
So as Desmond Tutu said in the video, we are all part of one shared earth. And we may not all be experiencing the effects of climate change equally, but we are all contributing. We're also not all contributing equally. So those of us that may be contributing more have more responsibility to step up and help those people that are feeling the effects even more so. So divestment from fossil fuels is something that had been talked about for some time by climate change activists, but it didn't really come into the mainstream until 2011. The Carbon Tracker Initiative published the Unburnable Carbon Report. This report discussed the global carbon budget. The idea behind this is that only so many gigatons of carbon dioxide can be released into the atmosphere if we wish to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, which has been a widely agreed upon number if we want to avoid the worst effects of climate change. So this report said that in the first half of this century, we could release 886 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But in the first decade, we had already released 321 gigatons of carbon dioxide, leaving only 565 gigatons of carbon dioxide to be released in the latter 40 years of the first half of this century. So in 2012, Bill McKibben, who's the founder of 350.org, came out with an article in Rolling Stone, and he did some calculations to figure out what this meant for fossil fuel use and fossil fuel exploration. He calculated that 80% of fossil fuel reserves must be left in the ground in order for us to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius. The problem with this is fossil fuel companies have already factored in most of these reserves into their economic plan. And so we have this entire system built on the fact that we will be able to burn all of these fossil fuel reserves. But if we do that, we will far exceed the 2 degrees Celsius warming that will allow us to have a livable planet. So Phil McKibben and 350.org put a lot of their efforts into starting the fossil fuel divestment movement. And in 2014, there had already been 13 colleges and universities, 28 cities, and 42 religious organizations that had committed to divesting from fossil fuels. And this number has since significantly increased. There are 108 colleges and universities, 161 religious organizations, and 85 cities that have committed to full or partial divestment. This includes other organizations such as for-profit institutions, philanthropic organizations, and total there are 706 institutions worldwide that are divesting. This has totaled $5.46 trillion that have been divested from the fossil fuel industry.
As Jocelyn was saying, the divestment movement among institutions of higher education is growing, and it's important to note the strength in symbolic acts that Carrie Ann spoke to earlier. And so today I'm going to tell you about universities that have partially, fully, and universities that are working towards divestment. And I'm going to tell you about Stanford University and the University of Dayton. Stanford, as a large and well-known university, has taken the bold move to divest from coal. In making the statement, President John Hennessy stated that Stanford has a responsibility as a global citizen to promote sustainability for our planet, and we work intensively to do so through our research, educational programs, and campus operations. The university's review has concluded that coal is one of the most carbon-intensive methods of energy generation, and that other sources can be readily substituted for it. Moving away from coal in the investment context is a small but constructive step, while work continues at Stanford and elsewhere to develop broadly viable energy solutions for the future, which is really important symbolically in taking that step. Secondly, the University of Dayton is the largest private university and the first major Catholic institution to divest from fossil fuels. From Pope Francis's urge to address climate change boldly, locally, and globally. And so we see at Western divesting from fossil fuels, taking that step, addressing climate change locally here in the Gunnison Valley, but also globally as a university of higher education.
So there's no, go back one slide. Oh, maybe go to, yeah, okay. So there's no overstating the role that student-led campaigns have played in social movements, but it's really important to understand that the confrontation of fossil fuel industry's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions extends far outside of university and college campuses. Keep It in the Ground was a response to the 2015 Paris Accords, which agreed to keep rising temperatures under 2 degrees Celsius by keeping 80% of existing fossil fuels in the ground. And it's over 400 organizations in 60 countries that have gathered together. And the most important aspect of what they do is telling world leaders that we intend to hold them accountable for these agreements. Break Free 2016 was last May to draw attention to what was then the hottest month on record. And perhaps the most notable mobilization from that was hundreds of kayakers in Australia gathering together to make this lovely picture. And of course, if any of you were here for Aaron Wise's talk last night, then you received an extremely visceral account of what the No Dabble campaign meant to Indigenous people in this country and globally. So now we can go back. And this last aspect of divestment that we want to touch on is really the other half of divestment, and that's the divest to invest approach. And so this idea that when you take money out of specific industries, where are you going to put them in a way that's socially responsible? So the Morgan Stanley Capital International company, which is an organization that produces research-based indices for investors looking to make better decisions, was pressured by many climate-focused groups, including 350.org, to release this study about in terms of what happens when you invest into renewable energies and specifically divest from fossil fuel industries, and found that the average increase in return was 1.2%, so that sort of, very much so, demystifies the idea that divestment is financially harmful to the institutions that choose to do so. And a notable actor in this divesting was actually the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and it's important to note there that they received their inheritance from Standard Oil, so the statement to divest from coal, oil, gas, and tar sands and reinvest in renewables in a 3-year process that ends at this year and has already received a return on investment is pretty significant. The president, Stephen Heitz, was quoted saying that it became increasingly uncomfortable to be fighting global warming on the one hand and then investing in businesses that cause global warming. So in terms of a symbolic act, this is huge. And it's and so this whole discussion of divestment has really, we've always been working under the Constitution that profits cannot take priority to life on Earth. And so we've had to ask ourselves, how do we express the urgency of this issue and still invite a discussion of collaboration and find the best way forward? Because in agreement with Rachel Carson, there's no shortage of work to do, and we have to take this next step. So now I think is a good time to break up into these tables, and we're gonna have 4 different tables, and we'll definitely need help finagling them. If we can get like people to group maybe 4 for each corner, each with a different topic. So please go to where you feel most compelled. I will be at the surgical divestment table with Dr. Sally Hayes, and surgical divestment is what Taylor noted with Stanford, choosing to divest from specific industries like coal, or not necessarily specific industries. In the case of Barnard College, they chose instead to divest from any company that had thwarted climate science. So essentially they divested from climate deniers, which is a really interesting and cool concept. So if that interests you at all, please come to surgical divestment and we'll have it over here.
Yeah, so myself and Taylor Paulson will be in this, my left-hand corner here, looking at full divestment in a similar style to either Dayton University that Taylor touched on, or maybe Middlebury College that wasn't touched on but has divested almost entirely from fossil fuels. And Dr. Kate Clark will be joining us as well, and we will be teasing out what that may or may not look like for Western and what implications that could potentially have. And we would love your input on it.
I will be at the energy transitions table. At this table, we will be discussing what beyond the symbolic act of divestment can be done here in the Gunnison Valley. As Kendall mentioned at the beginning, Western is a huge player in this community. And so we will be talking about what Western, the county, and the city can do to work together in order to figure out ways that we can use different energy sources here on campus and in town, and in order to do that more on the ground, what we're doing here in the valley, rather than the symbolic, or in conjunction with the symbolic act of divestment. That will be back in that back corner there, and joining me will be County Commissioner John Messner and Dr. Chavez.
All right, finally we have our alternatives to divestment table. Joining me at that table will be Mr. Gary Steffens and Dr. John Hausdorfer. This will be in this my back left corner. So we want to recognize that we have some gracious donors from the fossil fuel industry that have helped in part to fund programs, buildings, faculty decisions, as well as the private scholarships that we as students very much depend on. And we can't forget that the contributions fossil fuel has given to today's society, modern medicine, lighting, PowerPoints, the cars that we drove to get here. So we want to see if there's some way that we can collaborate with this industry and still find a way to address climate change moving forward. That'll be back there.
So what we'll be asking you all to do at these tables, we will be engaging in general discussion about these, but we also want you to try to tease out different aspects of what this approach might look like. And so we're going to leave this up here so you have some idea of what we're looking for, but we want to get strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of what each option might look like for Western. And in about 25 minutes, we'll come back together, we'll present what each table discussed, and then we'll have a little bit of a closing discussion and Q&A.
Reporting back will be reporting back. We'll start here with energy transitions. Who wants to report for energy transitions? Lauren Holman.
Cool, so, we were energy transitions, right? So we tried to take kind of a little bit of time to quickly talk about broadscape and then to focus on what we thought we were kind of running through the SWOT analysis for energy transition opportunities in the Valley. We discussed strengths as increasing diversity of our energy resources on campus. That Western could be positioning itself to positively influence the rest of the community, the kind of lead by example mentality, and then also kind of furthering our community involvement in that capacity. Opportunities, we saw that we could create as a county and as a group of citizens more sustainable housing developments, right? And we're talking about things that are regionally effective in building science, in increasing our sustainability in building science of our existing and new homes. Also talked about things, fuel transitions in fleet vehicles and buses, things like E85 or biofuels, energy dependence from local renewable sources, right? Considering what works here or what has the opportunity to work here with great installation values, as well as things like ground source heat pumps. And then seeing how we could make opportunities and connections with our energy management programs and our other programs on campus and small businesses and within the community to be considering that full spectrum of energy. Threats, we talked about if Western, say, were to make a large investment in renewables on campus, what does that do to the energy portfolio of the city of Madison municipal energy provider, right? Do they have to shift? Do they have a cost burden that shifts somewhere else? Does somebody, we didn't really have a full answer to that, but it was something we thought about as a possibility. And then I guess that kind of transitioned to our weakness, sorry. And then utilization, a weakness currently in energy transition here is a high reliance on electric heat sources in homes in the Valley, which is far less efficient than natural gas or a vast majority of other sources and costs people a lot of money. And then kind of the limitations of GCA's contracts with Tri-State. And this is not just GCA's issue, but it's issues for cooperatives all across the country about the level of renewables that can be in their energy portfolio. That's us.
Great, so nobody volunteered, so you get to keep listening to me. In terms of strengths, we talked about how we're surgical divestment. So the idea of divesting from something specific, whether it be a specific industry or some sort of moral imperative. So yeah, you can put your specific stamp. That was one we talked about, and that it's a very tangible way of divesting. It's not overwhelming. It looks at the long-term impact, and that there is a moral imperative was a strength in terms of addressing climate and environmental concerns, and how it the impact it has for us as a university in terms of a statement of our mission. Weaknesses were that there is no guarantee of an increased return on investment. It could threaten donors to specific programs, And how do we do it is a question, and would that mean actually changing who we invest with? And that's a pretty big task. For opportunities, we talked about how it could shift the market by demanding renewables and links to a strong mission on climate change. It can attract different donors, so increasing our diversity of donors. Again, we talked about the moral imperative. And like in Barnard, who divested from those who thwarted climate science, it targets the suppression of knowledge. So Sally Hayes brought up that it actually can speak to the academic integrity of an institution. It also allows for possible local and renewable options, depending on where you choose to reinvest, and really calls for local decision making. And then in terms of threats, again, we talked about the loss of donations and the effect this can have on different communities. We've talked about coal specifically, but it could be true of any community that produces fossil fuels if you surgically chose to divest from that specific one. Yeah, so that was us. Woo.
All right, so we're the full divestment table.
Stand up.
All right, so we talked about just the symbolic significance of what a full divestment would mean. And the main question that we come to is, are we ready? And something like a full divestment is a bold, confident statement. And I think it would reflect that, yes, we are ready. Just to quote Plan B, that climate change is a wartime mobilization. It will require wartime mobilization to shift from our current habits. So that's the strength of a full divestment. The weakness is we think that it does kind of, it does weaken a partnership that we have with our systems in place, and those being oil, and that a full divestment doesn't really reflect a transition process. It is arrogant, but maybe that's something that we do need. The opportunities that it opens up, just on a symbolic level, it opens up conversations to positive alternatives. It's that confidence. But threats, I would definitely expect that we'd see an emotional response from the people invested and just the culture of oil as a whole. So just the take-home point on here is the confidence of what full divestment would provide for us, but also recognizing that it does have some weaknesses. And I guess as a collection, we kind of talked about that, what that might be better reflected in a strategic divestment.
No. So we came up with multiple different, what's the group we're part of? Alternative investments. I mean, it's simple geothermals. So we could do like solar farms, wind farms, stuff like that, but how would we afford it? And the big thing is just sort of like figuring out reasonable tactics. Gary, correct? Came up with some really good ideas of bringing in people, like I guess you could say faces, whether it's environmentalists, petroleum people, geologists, climatologists, whatever it is, bringing them in, giving us like the full view of what actually is going on out there in the corporate world, and then more or less teaming up with them. These companies have, especially oil companies, natural gas, a little bit of cash, but the thing is to be able to reinvest it into us. Western has programs that literally just a handful of schools have in this nation of teaming together and just, collaborating minds. And that was like another idea of collaborating these three, courses of study into one, having each other take each other's classes in a sense, but also, even potentially, what I was going to add at the end was just, like once a month, sitting down debating this. I mean, our generation, I'm a couple years older than most people in here, but our generation is very opinionated, not really open to other people's opinions where it's like, I'm right regardless, but we have that moving mountain, I guess, movement here at Western of being open-minded, accepting other people and their ideas, regardless if you agree or not, but coming onto that common ground to agree, to disagree, but to respect each other's interests, that we all at the end of the same day are here to learn and potentially go successful in a career or in a lifestyle that we wish to supply for others. But it's just more or less finding the right ways, I guess the means, the feasibility of more or less what makes sense, and actually like projecting on that and not, I guess, twiddling our thumbs with it. But, yeah. Did I cover it?
Okay, we're gonna walk back.
So we do have a email sign-up sheet up here at the front with a pen. If anyone is interested in continuing this conversation with us, please sign up, put your name and email. Also, we will be meeting next Wednesday night, 5 p.m. in the first floor of the library to be having this conversation. So we hope that some of you can join us and we can start talking about what happens now. Because now that we've started this conversation, this is really only the beginning, and so we need to continue having this and figure out what Western can do next.
And it's Earth Week, so celebrating that is important.